Welcome back to the Shuffle Squad. Zach Lesage here. Ascended Heroes has been released for a little bit, and in this exciting release, the set is finally legal for competitive play as of today. So whether you're heading to a League Challenge, League Cup, or you're flying over to the Puerto Rico special event, this video should help you understand how the metagame's shaping up. Myself and Sable Creech have used the online results, City League results, and our own personal opinions on the metagame to help kind of place where these decks should be. There's not a lot of information online, but let's behold, there's two expert Pokemon players that got you. In the pinned comment, I'll have access to all these lists, copy and paste, and of course, give this video a like, share, subscribe. Ascended Heroes is known as a set that is not really great at pulling Pokepads, but there are a few more cards as we see in deck number 10, Joltik box. Lightball really brings this deck back from the grave, and even though it's seen some results with a top 8 in Las Vegas and recently a top 8 at Seattle, does this deck really have what it takes? I think the answer is yes. Lightball being able to power up Pikachu EX, go from 300 to 350, does stop it from kind of falling short against those pesky Pokemon EX that you just can't knock out. Mega Lopunny, Dragapult, etc. Now there's a point where maybe we could cut the Mega Mawile EX, but I do like it right now to kind of have that end of game gameplay where you're able to knock out your opponent's Pokemon relatively easily, and the game really just goes jolting charge, whether it's Iron Hands, Pikachu, whatever you're powering up, do a couple knockouts, and then pretty much anything can knock out your opponent's Pokemon. With Dragapult kind of pulling its way back into the metagame, this seems like a great choice for anyone who's looking for an aggro pick. Will it end up doing as well as we want to see in Puerto Rico? That's something to be determined, and of course, we will be covering everything on this channel. At number 9, we see another familiar deck come back from the grave, and that's going to be Tera box. Now, I did take Rahul's list that he posted on X, and he's kind of been one of the strongest Tera box players we have seen in the game. We gained the new Charizard, and I actually thought this was not the same card. Like, I thought it was a similar card to what we had before. I didn't realize it's completely a new card. Being able to quickly power it up and have a big fighting attacker can be quite strong to some of the big fighting weak Pokemon we have in our format. Otherwise, we're going to be using Fan Rotom, searching out our Hoots, our Noctowl, etc. Then we're going to be able to have Tera Pokemon in play, so we can activate Noctowl and power them up with Crispin, Sparkling Crystal, and of course we have Teal Mask Ogerplant with Energy Switch. Having Water, Grass, Fighting, Pikachu that can OHKO anything, and Lily's Clefairy as a Psychic type Pokemon does give you a lot of coverage. So if you are a fan of these box style decks, this deck does seem to have what it takes to bring things out. I don't know where I was necessarily going with that, but let me ramble. I think that it's just one of those decks where, like, it does suffer from some inconsistency issues, but if you know what you're doing with a deck like this, it seems like a pretty good choice. And if there was ever another good time to be bringing this deck out, this really seems like the time to be bringing this deck out. Raging Bolt finds itself sticking around, and we're going with Yurko Valencia's build over the past few tournaments. Now, not really too much has changed with this deck except the inclusion of a 1 of Pokepad. Now, Pokepad's not always going to be a 4 count in a deck, especially in a deck that's primarily filled with big basic Pokemon, aka rule box Pokemon that you're gonna have to search out with Ultra Ball or Nest Ball. Now in this case, you could use Pokepad with Noctowl, searching out the Noctowl with a Pokepad to kind of chain them. Otherwise, before you'd have to search for an Ultra Ball, discard some cards from your hand, so it does make this deck a little bit more resourceful. I do like the Sandy Shocks EX because there are quite a few fighting weak Pokemon at the top, just looking at Mega Kangaskhan in this deck, really giving you some options there. Raging Bolt EX does do that whole pow, 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 big OHKO knockout that you can knock out pretty much whatever you want with enough energies in play. And I do like with decks like Dragapult and Gardevoir still seeing a lot of success, having access to Wellspring Ogerplant EX that you can go Torrential Pump and knock out a couple weak Pokemon. Shaman's a little bit on the decline, so it seems like a decent enough strategy that could end up working. Do I think Raging Bolt's going to be the absolute best deck? Not really, but it is one of those things where if you are a Raging Bolt fan, this really could be the deck that gets you those points this weekend. Here we have it, another deck that got a brief bump from Ascended Heroes, this time in the form of a 70 HP Snorunt. That might not sound like a lot, but we take Zach Cohen's list, who's been on an absolute tear lately. We slap in these new Snorunt, And now we have access to something that doesn't instantly get knocked out by Dragapult EX's doing 6 damage counters to the bench. That 10 HP could be the difference between them having the Lucha or them missing the Hawlucha. In any case, we're just going to be using Punk Up, powering up our Marnie Pokemon, using Shadow Bullet, and using Monkey Dory Frostlass to really put our opponent in a pinch. This deck's kind of been a tried and true tested deck that's kind of been on a little bit of the lower tier. However, it does seem like it is quite strong in our format right now. And I do think if you're a Marnie Grimmsnarl lover, it just seems like the kind of deck to kind of gravitate towards. Our Ascended Heroes format is more or less shaping up as Phantasmal Plus. Pokepad's really been a nice addition. Some decks like this get a little bit more of a bump with Snorunt, and other decks like Joltik get a little bit more. Sure, there might be another few decks in this video that might get even more than that, but that's why they'd be placed towards the top. Regardless, Marnie's Grimmsnarl EX does seem like a strong choice, has been doing really well lately, and I could see this rising from 7 all the way into the top 5. Gholdengo. A deck that I love, but I think I want it to be my Toxic X soon. This deck has brought me 3 of my day 2s this season, but it's also caused me quite a bit of heartache as well. It kind of does or doesn't, and I think that's like exciting for some, but at the same time, I do think Gholdengo EX can sometimes just draw with some pretty awful hands. If you want to check those out, check out my Instagram, Zach Lesage PTCG, posted about my EUIC run that unfortunately ended at a 5-3 record. Now, I do think Gholdengo EX is well positioned in the metagame. Dragapult seems to be clawing its way back up with the release of Pokepad. You do pretty well in decks like Marnie's Grimmsnarl, and there's a handful of other decks you go well into. That being said, there's also decks that you could just struggle into, like Gardevoir's a little bit of a tough matchup, and Zoroark has become a little bit more of a tough matchup. So we'll have to see how the rest of the metagame plays out. No new cards from Ascended Heroes here. I've added in a copy of Picnic Basket to help deal with Dragapult and Marnie's and all these spread-based decks that seem to be popping up a little bit more. Is it going to work? Is it a card that's going to get cut? Potentially. However, I think this is the way that I'd be running the deck. Mega Mobile seems like it's a really good addition, and it gives us the opportunity to have a hyper-consistent version of the deck focused around Secret Box. Charizard Noctowl just seems to be one of those staple top 5 decks at this point. I think it's been top 5 in a lot of my rankings over the past little bit, and it's a deck that I've put no new cards in from Ascended Heroes. Now, you might be wondering why in Tera Box we have a copy of Pokepad and this version of the deck doesn't. Well, it's one of those things where if I were to cut the Nest Ball, I couldn't necessarily go for a Pokepad, because what if you draw in a Nest Ball and you need one of those Terrapagos or your Wellspring? And in the case of Ultra Ball, what if you need to have access to Charizard or something else? So Pidgeot does allow you to search out pretty much whatever you need. So that's why I decided to go against Pokepad. However, I could see myself adding it in again in the future. Going with Jackson Ford's top cut list from the European International Championships, it does seem like a pretty strong choice instead of going with True Wind Trans version that they just won Seattle with. Why? Well, I like the wet aspect of this deck, using Torrential Pump to potentially just knock out your opponent's Pokemon out of nowhere, with a lot of Stage 2 Pokemon EX decks that have a lot of basic Pokemon that aren't really playing Shaman too much. I do think that Wellspring Ogerpon EX does seem like a good addition to this deck. Otherwise, we're just going to be using Charizard, loading up a bunch of energies, have access to Dusknoir, have access to Pidgeot, Noctowl, and just have a very consistent base for a Tera deck. Charizard really seems to be fighting strong in its last month of legality before, unfortunately, it gets rotated out once we receive Perfect Order, or not too shortly after that. Mega Absol has gone from one of those decks where I didn't think it was necessarily going to be that great of a deck. Tord kind of put it on the map, and I thought it was going to fizzle out. It did start to fizzle out, and then ever since Sydney Regional Championships, it kind of popped back into the metagame, having access to Mega Absol EX, so you could use Terminal Period with Monkey Dory to knock out whatever you want, having Claw of Darkness doing 200 damage. I went with a list that Grant Shen placed second with at the Seattle Regional Championships. Similarly to some other decks on this list, no new Ascended cards. However, it's strong enough in the Phantasmal metagame where it just kind of continues on, and it is very strong. I really like the synergy between Erica's Invitation and Mega Absol EX. Whether you want to use Erica's Invitation to bring a card out of their hand, something that they might want to play down, and then you could use Claw of Darkness to rip something else out of their hand, or use Claw of Darkness, see what's in their hand, then you decide to use Erica's. to be like an additional boss. This deck seems like it could be quite aggressive, and it's probably going to be a deck that I'm going to be trying out over the next few months. With myself having South Africa, Orlando, and Lima coming up, it does really seem like I want to try this deck. It's kind of the deck that I'm gravitating towards. So maybe you'll see me post about it a little bit more online. Like I said, me and Gholdengo are probably breaking up, but we might end up getting back together. You never know what it is. However, I do think between Lucas and Grand Shen and their group who've been playing this deck for a while, I really got to trust their mind on this one and really go for the gold when it comes to Mega Absol EX. Here we have it, arguably the deck that gained the most out of Ascended Heroes by not really gaining anything totally new is going to be Dragapult Dusknoir with Pokepad. A lot of the times you're going to be focusing on getting your base set up with Badoo, Dreepy, Drakloak, and Pokepad can search out any of those. It just can't really search out Dragapult EX. That's completely fine, and with Dragapult becoming a little bit more popular, we've switched from the Moltres tech to a Monkey Dory tech. So having access to Buddy Pop and Ultra Ball, Pokepads, it really does seem like this is going to be the default build of the deck as we go forward. A lot of players have been counting out Professor Turo as unnecessary clutter in the deck, and this is really where we're left. I wouldn't be surprised if most lists end up being 59 to 60 of this exact list. So if you are looking for something for Ascended Heroes, Dragapult Dusknoir does become a lot more consistent, and the metagame does seem like it's quite well equipped for it as we go forward. Dragapult's always seen success in the Pokemon TCG, so if we look at it, it's seen success, it gets better, and the metagame's looking good for it. That sounds like a trifecta home hit run, and I do think that Dragapult's going to see a lot of success at the Puerto Rico special event and other events in the Ascended Heroes format. Looking at Gardevoir, Gardevoir has been one of the top decks in format and tends to have a decent matchup against Dragapult among a lot of other decks in format. Sure, we have a few dark decks in the top, such as Mega Absol, Marty's Grimmsnarl, and more, but Gardevoir EX seems to rise against those time and time again. Now, Gardevoir didn't necessarily do as well as we wanted to see in Seattle. However, I do think that just means that at Puerto Rico, the deck could absolutely dominate. Maybe we'll see other players switch to other decks like Mega Absol as we saw in Seattle. You never know. However, I do think having access to Mega Diancie EX to be able to knock out some of your opponent's Pokemon like Enzork EX and getting close to that Mega Absol EX number really seems like the correct build. This Henry Chow / Makani Tran build of the deck does seem quite strong in that. I could see us switching the Mega Diancie for a Drifloon and cutting the Luxurious Cape for maybe a Bravery Charm, or just going the 1/1 like we currently have. However, that's really where I think most lists are going to be. Jolly Guardy does not seem as well positioned as it once was. Don't really have a particular reason on that other than just the way the metagame's been shifting. Not as many decks are going to be as held still when it comes to that jelly kind of tactic. So could be wrong. Maybe we'll see that being the better version, but I'm really going to be curious to see how the rest of the metagame shapes up. But this is not our number one deck of the week. There is a number one deck of the week, and I'm really excited to share that one with you. So let's see what we got. Enzork, everybody, and this is the deck that really gained the most, having access to Enzakrom that can now hit for 250 damage, and with Black Belt and Binding Mochi, you have the opportunity to hit your opponent for up to 330 damage, not including Monkey Dory damage. So having it as an option where you can snipe your opponent's Pokemon, hit for an OHKO, you have a shred that goes through everything. I do really think it's that deck that kind of has this well-encompassing kind of archetype, and it seems like it's just going to fit right in. Enzakrom is a card that I personally need to pick up from Ascended Heroes, because now the deck went from just kind of being like, we're trying to tape it together, or we're trying to make it with popsicle sticks and glue or gum or whatever else you want to put it together with. The deck seems like it's a full-fledged archetype, and I'm really excited to see how this deck plays out. I think we're going to see a lot of top players pick this for Puerto Rico special event. And going on about that, so where Enzork EX tended not to be one of the top decks that we wanted to face against, this seems to be one of the decks that you almost always want to play test against, because it's just kind of became him with that Enzakrom inclusion. We're probably going to see a handful of lists, maybe some that include Enz Reshiram or some other cards. However, I do expect this to be the generalized build. It's the deck that Tord Rekliv took to a 2000 rating on the Pokemon TCG Live application. Can't really argue with that. Those are some tough level games. And the one of Pokepad is just the cherry on top, being able to search out some of your pieces like that Enzakrom. However, you could also get out the N-Star Manitan. When you're trading and drawing so many cards, it just seems to be working just that well. And that's what we got going on for this video today. I hope that you enjoyed watching, learning, and kind of listen to me yap about the unfolding Ascended Heroes metagame. It's one of those kind of sets that's not going to really change too much, but if you change a few cards, it does really kind of adjust the metagame more than you think. I'm going to be covering over the events coming up. And for me, in terms of tournament gameplay, I will not be at Houston Regionals. I will be going to the Cape Town, South Africa special event. I just ended up booking my flight, so it's going to be my first time in Africa and my 6 out of 6 Pokemon continents that I've played in. So everything except Antarctica, I've played Pokemon on. So that's going to be a huge milestone for me and Michelle, who's also done the exact same. After that, I'm going to be going to Orlando, Lima, and I'll probably be at Indy and the North American International Championships as well. In terms of content coming up, I will be putting out my Seattle vlog, hopefully on Monday, as long as I have time to edit that, and then really crushing things out. I do have a fun trip coming out to Salt Lake City to see my friends at Kayfabe Cards. So if you're in the Salt Lake area and you want to hang out, hit me up. Other than that, stay tuned for more great stuff. And if you need coaching, hit me up at metafy.gg/@zachlessage. Much love to all y'all. Peace out and have a great one. Want to support the Shuffle Squad? Be sure to check out all of our sponsors in the description to pick up Pokemon TCG singles, sealed, and PTCG live codes. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed the content that we have today, and maybe you'll click on one of these other videos, enjoy those videos too. If you haven't already, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what video you want to watch next. Until next time, we'll catch up with all y'all later. Have yourself a great day.